Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Ukraine Dialogues, a 4-week short course. I'm Keegan Lundman, a senior studying history, Russian, and German at the University of Montana, and I lived in Kyiv, Ukraine for 6 weeks last summer to study Russian.
I'm Cameron Vaughn, a program coordinator at the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center and recent graduate of the University of Montana's Russian program. The Mansfield Center is committed to issues of ethics and international engagement, and our programs are supported by people like you. We would like to express our appreciation to those that made a donation in lieu of a course fee. Your support allows us to continue providing impactful public programming, student scholarships, and aid to humanitarian causes. We would like to thank Missoula Community Access Television for recording today's discussion as part of a media assistance grant provided to us.
We are honored to have with us today expert speakers to share their insights into the roles Ukraine and Russia play in the state of international democracy today. Professor Oksana Nezhivenko joins us from Spain, where she is residing after fleeing her home in Ukraine. Ms. Nezhivenko is a Mansfield Center alumna, is an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv, Moldova.
Our featured speaker today is Dr. Rob Saldin, director of the Mansfield Center's Ethics and Public Affairs program and a professor of political science at the University of Montana. Dr. Saldin's work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, as well as general interest outlets, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The New Republic, National Affairs, and The American Interest.
In the last part of today's session, speakers will address viewer questions today, so please pose your questions in the Q&A box throughout the discussion. Professor Nezhivenko, let's begin with you.
Thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen. Please let me know if you can hear me and see my presentation. Yeah, I hope it works. Okay, thank you to everyone for being with us today. For taking these sessions. I see we have a numerous group here, so it's an honor for me to be a voice of Ukraine for this course. I believe it's my way of being like an armed soldier. So today we speak about democracy, and I will just give a short overview what we discussed last time. So we discussed the reasons why Russia started current war, and I shared with you the 6 reasons that I find important, and I find the most important in this regard. The imperialistic doctrine of Russia, the strong propaganda that led to many people believing that what Russia is doing is actually protecting, and the language issue. It really stays very important to Russia to have Russian second language as a second state language in Ukraine, which never was. And 3 reasons from the Ukrainian side. We had too high trust in international treaties. We had a couple of Russian presidents who did very obvious pro-Russian policy. And we also had politicians, media personalities who did sort of unobvious pro-Russian policy, which led to some people question the sovereignty of my country. And today's session on democracy, I would like to start with a quotation by a very important person to me, and this is my grandmother. So, you know, when I was a little child, then I was a grown-up girl, then I became a student. And for every birthday that I had, for every birthday that my sister had and my parents had, our grandmother gave us only one wish, to never see the war. And I was laughing at her. I was like, how can we have war in the world of the United Nations? You name it, these institutions, abbreviations of institutions. We cannot have a war. So I was thinking, okay, this is the memory of the person who saw the World War II and who has really tragic memories about it. But it will never happen in this current modern world. And actually, when I asked my grandmother about what was the World War II, she always started crying. So I really know nothing from my grandparents about this war because it was very painful for them. And yeah, I believe this will be my wish to my grandchildren now. So democracy. And today, what is the day 48 of the war? The numbers of personnel from Russian side is growing, that we killed, the numbers of aircrafts damaged and destroyed, helicopters, tanks are growing, and I'm proud of my army like never before. So the war is there, unfortunately. Democracy. What do we understand by democracy? We learn at school, at the university, that democracy is the rule of law, free elections, political expression, ability to speak freely, to participate, to protect human rights. But now I know that it is not only that. It is also preserving our planet, our Earth, our world, our home. And unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only one area of war, the only one area of conflict. We do have issues all over the planet: Myanmar, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Palestine. So Ukraine, unfortunately, is not the only one. So probably there have been some issue with the way we treat democracy on this planet. And yeah, I also looked up at the dictionary, my favorite Merriam-Webster, how do they define democracy? So democracy is the government by the people, a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised directly by them or by their elected agents under a free electoral system. So basically free elections. It is also belief in or practice of the idea that all people are socially equal. Amazing idea, but does it really happen in this current world? If we are all equal, why a peaceful building where children live, teachers, doctors, probably, why it happened in the first days of war in the capital of European country, where war hasn't been for decades, since the World War II, and then it happens in a neighbor district from my home. It also happened with the very famous in Europe building. This is the TV tower. It was the tallest freestanding metallic structure until 2012, and it was hit on March 1st by a Russian missile. I'm really proud of Russian soldiers who sometimes miss the targets, and it is still standing, it is still broadcasting, and people in Ukraine can still watch TV. It actually is a couple of 10 meters lower than the World Trade Center that was destroyed in 2001. So what is the problem with the world democracy if we have these casualties in current world? And here I would like to share with you one very important news that was published at RIA Novosti on April 3rd. RIA Novosti is famous for being like a Russian state news agency and the voice of the Kremlin. So they published the article, which was called "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine." You know, like, what should we do with the dog? What should we do with something inferior? And in this article, if you really want to laugh, and if you read Russian, please search for it, and you will find it amusing. So they treat in this article all of Ukrainians like, of course, Nazis, and like uncivilized people that needs to be educated. And they plan to perform liquidation of all army formulations on the territory of my country, including the armed forces of Ukraine. It's like, you know, why any country has a right in the democratic world to dictate these things to other sovereign and independent countries. Also, Russia states they want to create bodies of some self-governments on the liberated territories, liberated, please read occupied, and protect the population from the terror. So they occupy and they try to protect. They want to deploy the Russian information space. According to Freedom of Expression Index, the free media state in Russia is at the level of 0.4, while in Ukraine it is 0.58, so the higher the better, and in the USA 0.74. So like we have a bit higher than Russia, well, quite higher than Russia, and we should go down. Withdrawal of education materials containing Nazi ideology. I teach at the university. We do not have such education materials. Mass investigations of crimes against humanity. I will give you a couple of examples of crimes against humanity that are happening currently because of Russia. Adoption under the supervision of Russia of primary normative acts of denazification. So go read it. It's really something very, very sick happening in this country that they want to change in my country. So democracy and democracy in Russia. Is it really a democracy or is it another kind of peace or state? And according to Diamond, there are 4 cornerstones of democracy: fair and free elections, participation in politics, human rights, and rule of law. Yeah, I already quoted you the Freedom of Expression Index. If you search how many journalists, how many political activists, NGO activists in Russia were killed, it's like it's like very, very long list. Just a few very famous last names: Listyev, Politkovskaya, Nemtsov, all of them killed for their free speech. Elections in Russia have not been free for the last like 20 years, with always one candidate winning or his clone. Rule of law, again, the index, Russia, country number 101st in the list of all countries in the world, Ukraine number 74, not also too high, but much higher than Russia, like 30 positions higher. USA number 27. Oh, okay, the higher the better. So we need to go up, not to go down. And talking about international democracy and the war in Ukraine, I need to mention the Budapest Memorandum that I briefly discussed last time. So this was the treaty that was signed back in 1994, and it was aimed at providing security assurances to 3 countries: Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, in exchange for our non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And 3 signatories, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, agreed to provide security for us if something happens. So this something happened back in 2014 when the Russian Federation occupied Crimea. And well, most of politicians now see that this was the mistake of the world, to show that we are too loyal to Russia, and this led Russia to current war. So again, there was a very strong treaty that Ukraine believed in very, very much. We believed in this kind of international democracy. It failed enormously. What happened during a couple of days that we did not meet with you? On April 11th, yesterday, there was a chemical weapon spread in Mariupol, phosphorus bombs, forbidden by the rules of war. Sweden and Finland yesterday announced that they plan to join NATO. Very peaceful countries, very neutral countries. They never really expressed their wish to join NATO, as far as I remember. But here they have been speaking about this for a couple of weeks. And yesterday, again, the voice of these 2 countries, they want to join this 30-country alliance to become 32. So Sweden's ruling party debates about joining NATO. Finland plans to have this decision within weeks. if you can see this map, Finland shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, and it was struck by invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And if you remember the history, there already was war between Russia and Finland. It was USSR. At the time, it was 1939 and 1940. For 104 days, there was an invasion of Finland by Russians. And according to the latest polls, more and more Swedish and Finns support joining their countries to NATO, and 84% of Finns regard Russia as a big military threat. And you know, these two countries, they express their interest. They want to do something with their internal and external policy, but here is Russia to warn them that the Nordic nations' accession would not bring stability to Europe. Like, why do they care? Isn't it the way Sweden and Finland lives? This is the way that democracy should exist and should not be questioned, in my view. And I would not speak with you from asylum, you know, if democracy really was so efficient. And now some examples of crimes against humanity that happen in my country. Forced deportation of thousands of civilians from occupied Mariupol to Russia. Deliberate killing of Ukrainian civilians by members of the Russian forces. Numerous rapes of women and babies. Bucha massacre. Missile attack and shelling in Donetsk, Irpin. Mass torture in Makariv. These are all cities that I visited many times. Bombing in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Zhytomyr, etc. Abduction and torture of civilians in Kherson. Disrupting humanitarian corridors. Many humanitarian corridors were cancelled because Russians were shooting them. Tortures and deliberate killing of civilians in Hostomel, Irpin, Borodyanka. Use of cluster ammunition. Targeting nuclear power plants. Looting and marauding. Use of children as human shields. Attacks on cultural properties, hospital. So where is democracy here? I'm very glad that the USA is helping us, and US Department of State on March 23rd wrote this press statement about war crimes by Russia's forces in Ukraine. So this is official. We in Ukraine actually just acquired a group of European Union experts who came to Ukraine to investigate war crimes, to protect us, to sort of bring more democracy even to the war. Some other signs of democracy. Back in a couple of weeks ago, in March 15th, 3 European prime ministers, Polish prime minister, Czech prime minister, Slovenia's prime minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, Petr Fiala, Janez Janša, they visited Kyiv. Kyiv at war. March 15th was a really very scary period. And I was so surprised. I was so touched by them visiting Kyiv and providing this even, you know, symbolic help. And then on April 8th, the head of European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, together with Josep Borrell, European Union's foreign policy chief, and Eduard Heger, Prime Minister of Slovakia. They also visited Kyiv. They not only visited Kyiv, they visited the city of Bucha, which is famous for this horrible massacre that happened there. And they all provided much more aid after their visits because they saw it with their own eyes. Moreover, yesterday, Josep Borrell, and I quote him here, he said, "Go to Kyiv, go as much as possible. This message is directed to the European politicians to come to my country and to see what Russia is conducting there." More visits. On April 9th, Karl Nehammer, Austria's chancellor, and extremely big friend to Ukraine, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK. He conducted this surprise visit. No one knew about it. And here he is, came to make a surprise and have a walk in the city. So these were all examples of democracy. And this is my last slide. where I also give some perspective that is happening currently in Ukraine to protect world democracy. So there are two independent international agencies working in Ukraine to investigate violations of human rights, namely International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the United Nations, and the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. So they are both working now there to detect these crimes and to hopefully punish those perpetrators in the future. On April 12th, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Irina Venediktova, stated that we collected evidence for thousands of war crimes cases and 5,800 investigations of war crimes have already been initiated. Finally, on April 7th, the United Nations made really good sign to all the world. They suspended Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council. If you know the story, Russia was voted to be suspended from this council, and when it was voted, even by the partners of Russia, to be suspended, Russia stated like, okay, we leave this council because we don't want to be a member of it. So yeah, funny story. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. I hope to have a very productive Q&A session, and thank you again for having your interest in my country.
Thank you, Professor Nezhevenko, for sharing updates and the actions recently taken by global leaders. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Saldin.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Keegan. And Oksana, thank you. It's been an honor to be a part of this event today with you. And your perspective is just invaluable in this. And for anyone who didn't see last week's session featuring Oksana, I'd strongly urge you to go check that out. You can find those on the Mansfield Center website. So let me share my screen here. I obviously do not have the knowledge about Ukraine in particular that Oksana does. Let's see if I can figure out how to Cameron, do you know what how I can get this to fill the screen?
If you go to presenter view in slideshow, I believe that should do the trick.
It should be slideshow, or you can try to type F5 if you have it.
F5. Let's see if that does it. Okay, well, I'm not sure it's necessary. I can just cycle through these anyway. So I can't speak to the unique situation on the ground in Ukraine in anywhere near the capacity that Oksana can. But I did think that what I'd try to do is to place this in a bit of a larger context, and that I'd start just by noting an experience I had last week. I was on the road. I was in Chicago, and I was telling Dina a couple of days before I left that I think, amazingly, this was my first trip east of Rock Creek in 2 years. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Western Montana geography, Rock Creek is just, half an hour or something east of Missoula. But so it was a pleasure after these 2 years to get on the road. But I had the good fortune to meet up with an old friend in Chicago who knows the city well. And he took me to a neighborhood I'd never been to. And that neighborhood is known as Ukrainian Village. It's one of Chicago's many great West Side neighborhoods. And we decided to go there for the obvious reasons. And it most certainly didn't disappoint. It's a lovely little neighborhood just on its own terms. And of course, it's been a hub of activity in recent weeks, standing in solidarity with the home country. And this photo was taken right at the outset of the invasion. But even now, you walk around the neighborhood, flags are everywhere, signs are everywhere. We were at one restaurant where the bartender was busy making very large quantities of a shot in which the top half of the liquid was royal blue, and it sat on top of another segment, which was bright yellow, of course, the Ukrainian flag. Not quite sure how they managed to pull that off, but it was quite impressive. But drinks aside, one of the things that stood out and that was referred to in a lot of the handmade signs and the murals and the newspaper clippings that people had put up in the neighborhood was the larger way in which this conflict has been framed. And that is as the latest and a very important episode in a broader conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. And that this is a conflict fundamentally pitting Ukraine, a democracy, against Putin's Russia, an authoritarian regime. And today I thought I'd just try to take a little bit of a step back from the situation on the ground in Ukraine that Oksana spoke to so eloquently, to reflect on that broader context in which this conflict is taking place. And so perhaps a place to start is that in recent years, many experts have argued that democracy both here in the United States, but also democracy on the global scale has been on the decline, that it is suffering from a crisis of confidence, that it's been on the defensive amidst a revival of authoritarianism. While this particular situation in Ukraine certainly remains dire, and while the many warning signs about the broader health of democracy, they're still absolutely with us, I would suggest that the degree of unity and the degree of purpose in responding to Putin's unprovoked attack, both internationally and domestically here in the United States, are encouraging. And taken together, they might even offer some real hope for a renewed commitment to democracy. And again, after what we've experienced in recent years, that's a welcome development. And obviously a lot could change in the future weeks and months, but for right now, there is some reason to be encouraged. Now, one quick clarification I want to make. When I use the word democracy here, I actually mean a certain type of democracy. I'm speaking of liberal democracy. And when we speak of liberal democracy, this is not liberal in the sense of liberal versus conservative in the American context. This is liberal in a broader sense to refer to a democracy in which we have protections for minority rights, in which we have free and fair elections, in which we have the rule of law, right? And this is a very common understanding, I think, of what people have in mind when they speak of democracy. And in fact, Oksana touched on all of these elements earlier, but it's also worth noting that it is possible to have illiberal democracy. That is democracy in which you have elections and majority rule, but in which you don't have necessarily things like protections for minorities, that you don't have civil liberties, that you don't have free speech and free assembly, freedom of religion, free press, all of these things that we kind of take to be a part of what we mean when we speak of as democracy. So I think that's an important distinction to make. But let's begin just by taking a little bit of a step back in time. This is an episode of or an issue of the journal, The National Interest, that came out back in 1989, and it contains perhaps the most provocative and influential idea in the intellectual sphere concerning the state of democracy in the post-Cold War world. And it was written by Francis Fukuyama, who is a political scientist. He's currently at Stanford University, and his argument can kind of be boiled down to this. His argument in 1989 is that we weren't just at the end of the Cold War, right? It wasn't just the end of this conflict that had dominated the world since the end of World War II. In fact, it was something much larger than that. For Fukuyama, we had reached what he called the end of history. And by that, he meant the end of the ideological struggle over how to arrange society. And so in his analysis, in any way you look at it, right, from a political standpoint, from the standpoint of economic dynamism, from an ethical standpoint, in terms of allowing for human flourishing, liberal democracy had proven to be the best system. And so there's no other viable alternative to liberal democracy at this point. There's no progress beyond this way of ordering society. And Fukuyama was quick to say, look, that's not to say that there won't be further conflicts and tumultuous events, or even that democracy will encounter setbacks from time to time. It just means that over the long haul, democracy will continue to expand its reach, and that it won't have any real viable challengers, right? So I would, though, note that, as you can see there with the title, The End of History, it does contain a question mark. So that always kind of suggested to me that he was hedging a little bit, right, at least, kind of, is it really the end of history? Maybe, maybe not. But in any event, again, this essay appeared in 1989. Just a few short months later, we had this happen, right? The fall of the Berlin Wall. This, of course, was one of the most notable events of the 20th century. Berlin Wall was arguably the single most iconic image of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. And the fall of it caught nearly everyone by surprise. This wasn't something that seemed to be imminent at the time. And equally notable, the wall didn't come down after a big military encounter or some other kind of terrible violence. Rather, it seemed to collapse of its own weight. And of course, it marked the end of the Cold War. Right, and again, this occurred just a few months after Fukuyama came out with this end of history thesis. Now, you can imagine then that immediately lent a lot of additional credibility to this idea that liberal democracy had won out, that it was on the march, that it didn't have any more viable challengers to it. Right, well, a couple of years later, we witnessed another event, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which again seemed to have been anticipated by very few people, but that gave further credence to this idea of the end of history. And in the years that followed, it did seem as though Western-style democracy was on the march. Challengers to it were weak. They were on the defensive. Around the world, people at least seemed to be yearning for the good life that democracy seemed to afford, from all these personal liberties and freedoms to political equality to economic growth to a more globalized and peaceful future. Right? Well, a few years after the original publication of Fukuyama's essay, he came out with a book. Right, and one thing I've always taken to be kind of an indication of this post-Cold War confidence in liberal democracy is that in 1992, when the book came out, which just expanded on the initial article, that question mark in the title of the essay was no longer there, right? It no longer, it seemed, was necessary for there to be any hesitancy or debate over the claim that liberal democracy was unchallenged. Now, it's important to note, I think, that Fukuyama's idea always had its critics, and that particularly was the case after the 9/11 attacks and in their aftermath, when some noted that perhaps, gosh, not everyone maybe is totally on board with democracy. So maybe there are some real challenges out there to it. But in recent years, say the last decade or so, those critiques have only grown. And we've seen, among probably many other things that could be noted, we've seen the rise of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Erdogan in Turkey, the rise of Putin in Russia with its efforts to reclaim the role it played during the Soviet heyday, China's rapid rise and growing influence as a global power, even as it takes deeply illiberal and anti-democratic actions, including obviously the suppression of the Uyghurs in Hong Kong, as it eyes Taiwan. We've also seen the rise of illiberal extremist movements in the heart of many Western democracies, right? In many European countries, and of course, even here in the United States. Much more could be said about all of these developments and many others, but you get the general picture. Well, this rise of authoritarian regimes, the decline of democracy globally, it has been charted in many scholarly reports that seek to measure these things, like this one from Freedom House, an entity that tracks all of these developments globally. It's also been a hot topic in intellectual circles among defenders of liberal democratic societies who are worrying that these societies are on the defensive and succumbing to the rising tide of authoritarianism and illiberalism. I'd briefly note maybe that Anne Applebaum's book there on the left, it's only her most recent, was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, so certainly a notable one, but she's also the author of an acclaimed book from a number of years ago called Red Famine, which is about Joseph Stalin's brutal war on Ukraine, which is, I think, certainly helpful in understanding the historical roots of what's going on over there today. But in any event, the clear takeaway from all of this work from scholars and intellectuals is that democracy has been on its heels. And now it is democracy that is on the defensive, facing very serious challenges, both externally and maybe more concerning internally, right? And of course, in the United States, we had our own experience with this. I think more than anything else, it was the January 6th insurrection that brought this home for many Americans, although we could point to various things that occurred in the years leading up to that. And of course, you know, one can look at January 6th here in the United States as an event that is unique to the United States. And in some ways, of course, it is. But it's also the case that many of the factors that fueled the insurrection, you can look at democracies around the world, and you can see the same type of forces at work. So in any event, it clearly ratcheted up these widespread worries that the state of democracy was not good. And it generated concerns that the apparently thriving authoritarian regimes had maybe certain strengths relative to democracies. And you know, just thinking about democracy, you know, they're plagued by internal divisions, political polarization, dysfunctional institutions, and maybe most concerning, you know, there's a big bunch of public opinion polling showing sharp declines in citizens' support for democracy, sharp declines in their trust in institutions, increasing openness to illiberalism, right? And so this was the broader milieu, I think, that was out there about democracy, both in the United States and abroad, just several weeks ago. This was the overriding view of things, at least among experts. And I think it's clear that those perceptions of weakness played at least some role in Putin's decision to launch his war in Ukraine. Now, all that said, you know, here we are several weeks after that war started, and obviously the war is as horrible as it is, and as much suffering as there has been in Ukraine, it's going better than almost anyone could have anticipated. And while we appear to be witnessing the beginning of a new phase in this conflict, and with that, There's obviously a lot of uncertainty. There are reasons to be concerned, but I guess what I'd like to kind of close with here is that there are also reasons to be optimistic, particularly in this kind of broader sense of just charting where global democracy is at. First and foremost, something to be optimistic about and inspired by is the resistance from the Ukrainian people, from the Ukrainian military, from the Ukrainian political leadership. That truly has been remarkable. And again, this is not something that anyone, or at least very few people, would have anticipated at the beginning of all this. I would note that the reaction from NATO has also been encouraging and somewhat surprising. NATO has responded relatively quickly, with strength, with unity. Not that long ago, there was talk of breaking up NATO, and of course that could return. Right, one of the finalists in the French election would like to take her country out of NATO, and of course our previous president here in the U.S. Talked about getting out of NATO. But at least for now, the response from NATO, and along with some of the interest that's out there in adding new countries to the coalition, maybe very soon, that's all quite encouraging. I would also suggest that the U.S. response has been, on the whole, pretty impressive and effective. It does sometimes seem as though there isn't quite the sense of urgency that one might hope for, but still. And I guess beyond the kind of elite level leadership response, one thing that I've noticed is that after many years in which seemingly everything has been polarized, right? Damn near everything breaks down along sharp political divides. This one hasn't. There has been, at least so far, considerable unity among American citizens that we should be supporting Ukraine. And obviously there are some notable exceptions to that, but on the whole, this has broken through, and at least for now, it's broken through the polarization that has gripped our country. So taken as a whole, in this confrontation between a democracy and a brutal authoritarian regime, the forces supporting democracy have responded with a degree of unity and resolve that I think very few people would have anticipated. And that's certainly an encouraging and welcome development. Cameron.
Thank you, Dr. Saldin, for providing such great context on global democracy and reasons for concern, but also reasons for hope. We can begin our audience Q&A now, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A box.
And we'll start with a question for Dr. Nizhovanko from Jared Pietzmeyer. And just to contextualize a little bit for those of you who weren't here last week, we talked a lot about the events in 2013 and 2014 at Maidan Nezavyeshnosti, also known as Euromaidan. And Jared was wondering whether there is a sentiment among Ukrainian people of ill will toward either the EU or the US as a result of the relative inaction during Maidan of 2014, and maybe whether you could tie that to Ukrainian reactions toward US and EU involvement right now.
Very good question. Thank you for it. Definitely, we do not want to somehow object the help of the European Union or the United States, because the aid that we are receiving from the European Union and the United States is enormous. And I believe, and my colleagues in Ukraine believe, that we would not be as effective as in fighting against Russian troops, provided we did not have so much weapon that is given to us by these countries. There have been some sluggish response in a couple of first days, because really all the world, and I believe you can also agree with that, was expecting that Ukraine can fall. And I left Ukraine on the second day of the war because I was very frightened for my daughter, for my parents, for me, because I was not sure that our army is that strong. But like now, I get so happy to send my money to the army because I know that they will go in the right direction and they will support them so much. So European Union and other countries and the United States were maybe looking for the first couple of days, maybe a week, and then they saw how strongly we are fighting for our homeland. And I became so proud, even more proud for being Ukrainian and having the same blood as our soldiers do, because the way they record videos from the battlefield, of course not during battles, the way they sing Ukrainian songs, the way they dance Ukrainian dances, and it all shows us that we are all fighting for the same good reasons. And also the pictures that I shared with you of European leaders coming to Ukraine, giving signs of hope, of trust in us. We are very much thankful. We are not at all criticizing anyone, and happy to receive every weapon the world gives us, because we know what to do with this weapon.
Thank you, Oksana. I have a question for Dr. Saldin. David Andrews asks, do you think it's easier to be an authoritarian in 2020 compared to, say, 1950, or perhaps it's harder? Mostly thinking about technology's role and the role perhaps that social media can play in democracy. Rob?
Yeah, good question, and I think he hit on one of the big advantages that authoritarian regimes have now, and that actually that we're seeing being used in Russia currently, as best we can tell, and that is technology, and the use of disinformation. It used to take a long time, like these efforts to put out disinformation are certainly not new. But it used to take a long time to get that stuff out. And now with technology, what used to take several weeks can now be done in a matter of hours, maybe even less than that. And so that's an enormous advantage, and certainly something that democracies struggle with. I mean, we have our own challenges here with that, but it's been easier for authoritarians to harness that now, because they do have such strict controls over their society. They can harness it in a way and deploy it to their ends, whereas democracies kind of tend to be crippled by it. So it's almost kind of the worst of both worlds. Now, there are some things I think that can be done to address that. And one great piece, if you're looking for, I think, a thoughtful analysis of some of this, particularly as it pertains to internally within democracies. Jonathan Rausch, who's a scholar at the Brookings Institute, has a book out. There's also an essay version of it out called The Constitution of Knowledge, where he gets into some of these problems with technology. One of the better things I've read on this subject.
Thank you, Dr. Shelton. We have another question from Christine Hiller-Claridge, and she is saying she's been reading about the famously short attention span of the American public, and that Americans are quickly losing interest in the Ukraine crisis, and wondering how might this affect our support of Ukraine in Washington, or will it? And I would like to maybe tag on to this. What can we do to continue to keep support and public awareness up? And we'll start with Dr. Shelton.
Egan, I'm sorry, I missed most of that question. I heard something about short American attention span, I think, but I missed most of the rest of it.
My bad. Sorry about my microphone was probably not positioned correctly. And reading about the American public having a famously short attention span and sort of a quickly diminishing interest in the Ukraine crisis, how might this affect our support of Ukraine in Washington, if it will? And then I wanted to tag on, perhaps for Dr. Nezhivenko, after your answer, how might we continue to increase public awareness and continue the trend of Americans caring about the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's something to be really concerned about. You know, to the extent that this drags on for a number of more weeks or months, or more than that, will the American public continue to see this as a top tier issue? I mean, I already wonder if there's been a little slippage in that. And yeah, that's a concern. Obviously, you know, there's a pretty long track record of Americans kind of initially being moved by international events, but then having them gradually fall off the radar screen. Again, I guess, and so I certainly worry about that. I guess I would return though to the final point I made, and that is that the glass half full assessment of this, though, I think is maybe the more notable one, and just that you know, this is something that has really captured the American mind, is in the sense that we do across political boundaries, you know, not perfectly, but across political boundaries, across a lot of our normal divides, there is a great deal of support for Ukraine, and that's certainly encouraging, and I do hope that can be sustained.
I will go on with the answer. How can we, how can you and me and all of us spread the truth? Well, I believe events like this are very effective, and I thank again the Mansfield Center for creating this, all of you for doing this and discussing Ukraine. We are 150 here. I believe the recording will be watched by maybe 500 of you. If we all tell to our parents and friends about the democracy, about the horror that is happening in Eastern Europe, then at least 1,000 people will know about that. For me, that's enough. If we spread the truth this way, we can also, we academia, we can write articles. We can write academic articles, or just articles for all of us to read. Like after the last session, one of the students, Nancy, took an interview with me, and she is writing a material about our communication. Thank you for doing this, Nancy. Thank you for those of you who really have more interest besides the sessions. Even these little steps are very effective, and I believe, yeah, we're doing the right job, reading the right materials, and questioning all information that is coming to our ears and heads, because we have access to free media, not like some countries in the world.
Thank you, Professor Nezhivenko. One more question for you. Douglas Easterling says that there has been little news in the US media about the status of Odessa. Do you know of what's happening there? And if so, could you share with us an update?
Yes, of course, I know. I know everything that is happening in Ukraine. It's like constant flow of news. Odessa is Ukrainian. Odessa is doing everything to be Ukrainian. Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, these cities are believed to be, you know, Russian speaking. Again, this language issue, it is an important issue to be aware of. But they are very, very Ukrainian, and they are doing everything to show their Ukrainian state. Actually, Mykolaiv, if you look at the map of Ukraine, Mykolaiv is the city that protects sort of Odessa from Russian troops, and it is holding much pressure on this region, Mykolaiv region. And the head of Odessa, Vitaly Kim, he is like the funniest person we could see on the war, because he has this Telegram chat that he shares news every day with us. And he tells about positive news in such a funny way that we do not really believe that he's speaking about war, but holding the spirit of Ukrainians in such an extremely hard period, the way he does, again, shows that we are fighters. And the last, for the answer to this question, I would like to say that our media united, and like the most major medias, they all broadcast the same. They share TV broadcasting time among themselves, and they do not have competition. They just share united news. And even though in some of the occupied territories or the territories where the active war is happening, where TV is not available, Ukrainian government found enough ways to provide access to TV news of these united channels to the people of different kinds of different territories on Ukraine. We also have Telegram chat with constant the way we can read what is happening all over our country. And well, people who are on occupied territories, unfortunately, they see what is happening around around the occupied territories. They see numerous cases of rapings, of maraudery, of killing civilians, and of course they don't want to live under such suppression of their rights. That's why it's important to spread the truth. And yeah, Odessa is Ukrainian and will be.
Perfect, thank you. And we are running out of time, so we are just going to ask one last brief question from James Espeland and from a few others. How can we as citizens learn to cut through misinformation to get to the truth? And could you recommend some of the most reliable news sources to be reading right now, maybe in English and in Ukrainian or Russian?
Yeah, I can answer the second part of the question about the news. So the news that I'm reading, it is called Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian Truth. It is available in Ukrainian, English, and Russian. So if you have access to like websites or Telegram channels, Ukrainska Pravda is the place to be. Of course, not all information is shared due to secrecy of it. For example, we know that, and this is, by the way, one of the answers to the question about support of EU and the USA. The three countries that provide us with the largest, the four countries that provide us with the largest amount of weapons and military support are the USA, the UK, and Poland and Slovakia. But we do not know the numbers. But we know that it is coming there. So yeah, I suggest Ukrainska Pravda.
Yeah, and I'd only maybe add to that, you know, the one of the tricks is to not go down the social media rabbit holes, particularly on Facebook and Twitter. The algorithms there are such that they are designed to send us down some of those rabbit holes. And so that's maybe easy for me to say. I'm the last dinosaur who's never been on Facebook, and I've held out this long, and I think I'm gonna stick to it. But that really is one of the problems. I mean, in terms of like news sources, I think you can do very well, on these kinds of things, following the major sources that we have in the United States, New York Times and Washington Post. And there's certainly criticisms, some of which I think are valid, of some of these mainstream sources, but certainly for something like this, these are the operations that have the resources to have people stationed all over the world, and there's good things that come out of that in terms of reliable reporting. So yeah, I'd encourage people to maybe spend a little less time on Twitter and Facebook, and a little more time reading hard, good reported news.
Well, thank you both to our speakers, Oksana Nezhivenko and Dr. Saldin. We are so grateful to have your insight and the opportunity to continue learning about Ukraine, the war, its context, and its consequences. And we are looking forward to next week's session featuring economist Joanna Shelton, who is the former Deputy Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, who will speak to global economic consequences of the war. And Professor Nezhivenko will be joining us then as well. Registration is still open, and I will send the link in the chat.
And thank you all for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again next week.